Welcome to Windows on the World. Fascinating show for you tonight. First of all, I'd just like to let you know that the downloads have been disabled on Spreaker, which is the platform I use for broadcasting, but I won't be using that platform very much longer. You can actually download the podcasts from Podbean, and the links are on the homepage and the live shows page, where you'll find the full archive of all our Sunday shows. The links are there to Podbean, where you can download the shows. It's been an enormous inconvenience, and Spreaker are also stopping live broadcasts towards the end of the year, so I will be relocating to another service. I got a very interesting email today from one of our listeners, Sarah, and it was a photocopied bundle of declassified CIA documents with some writings about the UN and government, nationalism, perceived global problems of the 60s and 70s, including overpopulation. And within this bundle was a book called The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas, which was published in 1961. It's a short volume which covers Earth's cataclysms, one 11,500 years ago and one at 6,500 years ago. It uses the book of Genesis and relates Cuvier's theory of the Earth, published in 1812, to give it context, amongst several others. But unlike Comyn's Beaumont, the book does not give a specific area where this catastrophe happened, but that it spread out and it came from within the Earth, unlike the theories of Beaumont, where we're looking at catastrophes which happen through impacts on the planet by comets. The theories, though, again, unlike Beaumont's, are that the cataclysm came from inside the Earth. That's the important point we need to make here. There are references to Velikovsky, Charles Hapgood, Albert Churchwood and others throughout the book. What makes it interesting as additional research is that it compares Genesis of the Bible to being the new beginning after a cataclysm. The author also refers to the Nagas and the Hindu tales and gives references to stories which go back over 70,000 years. It's an interesting short volume. It's only about 45 pages. So I've decided to go through it in tonight's show. And it goes along very nicely, I think, with the historical aspects of the cataclysms that we've covered. And it gives another perspective, which I think is interesting because obviously I've been covering the idea and the theories of Comyn's Beaumont because they all add up. This book is very short, it's not heavy on detail, but it's got a lot of great information in. And it starts with the next cataclysm. In other words, as we've said in previous shows, this will happen again. And it says, like Noah's 6,500 years ago, like Adam and Eve's 11,500 years ago, this too will come to pass. With a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growing, throbbing, then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts, only it's not like any earthquake in recorded history. Now it goes on to say from an American perspective what happens and how through it rips through the mountains in California and wreaks havoc around the world. But basically, it says this happens very, very quickly, and a few lucky ones who manage to find shelter from the screaming wind on the lee side of Pikes Peak watch the sea of molten fire break through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow, piling higher and higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth and rising almost to their feet. Only great mountains such as this one can withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. It goes on. And it gets into this idea that on the seventh day, the horrendous rampage is over. The Arctic ice is ended, the Ice Age finishes, and a new Stone Age begins. The oceans, the great homogenizers, have laid down another deep layer of mud over the existing strata in the Great Plains, as exposed in the Grand Canyon, Painted Desert, and the Badlands. The Bay of Bengal Basin, just east of India, is now at the North Pole. The Pacific Ocean, just west of Peru, is at the South Pole. Greenland and Antarctica, now rotating equatorially in the torrid zone, find their ice caps dissolving madly in the tropical heat. Massive walls of water and ice surge towards the oceans, taking everything from mountains to plains in gushing, heaving paths, creating immense seasonal moraines. In less than 25 years, the ice caps are gone and the oceans around the world rise over 200 feet with the newfound water. The torrid zone will be shrouded in a fog for generations from the enormous amounts of moisture poured into the atmosphere by the melting ice caps. New ice caps begin to form in the new polar areas. Greenland and Antarctica emerge with verdant tropical foliage. Australia is now the new unexplored continent in the North Temperate Zone, with only a few handfuls of survivors populating its vastness. New York lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, shattered, melted by earth fire and covered by unbelievable amounts of mud. Of San Francisco and Los Angeles, not a trace is left. Egypt emerges from its Mediterranean inundation, new and higher, still the land of the ages. The commonplace of our time becomes the mysterious Baalbek of the new era. A new era, yes. The cataclysm has done its work well. The greatest population regulator of all does once more for man what he refuses to do for himself and drives the pitiful few who survive into a new Stone Age. Once more, the Earth has shifted its 60-mile thick shell, with the poles moving almost to the equator in a fraction of a day. Again, the atmosphere and the oceans, refusing to change direction with the Earth's shell, have wiped out almost all of life. So then he goes on to compare these cataclysms. Remember, we're talking about 6,500 years ago and previously 11,500 years ago. He says we join Noah, Adam and Eve, Atlantis, Mu and Olympus, and Jesus joins Osiris, Toara, Zeus and Vishnu. And then we get into the great floods. And he says Noah, Adam and Eve, Vishnu, Osiris, what do they have in common? Well, he says that they represent eras, ages apart, and yet somehow they all join in the next cataclysm and walk with us. So what he's doing is taking these old Hindu tales, which do go back a long time, and he's running them alongside the Bible. And this has been done before, but I think this volume, because of its simplicity and it's very concise, makes this interesting because, as I said, it's taking us away from the Cummins-Beaumont theory, which again, we've got to remember was 3,000 years ago. It was 1322 BC. So this is much before that. So all of it could be part of Earth's past. So he says there are others who walk with us too, men of science long forgotten, those who first saw that these tumbles, these cataclysmic catastrophes or revolutions of the Earth's shell have happened before, countless times. J. André de Luc in 1779 and George Cuvier in 1812 were the foremost. Dolomieu, the famous mineralogist, joined the consensus, as did Ischer and Forel, the Swiss geologists, also J. André de Luc Jr. and von Busch. They all agreed that the cataclysms were caused by the sudden revolutions of the surface of the Earth. Cuvier, in his Theory of the Earth, first published in 1812, based his conclusions on his unparalleled correlative research in stratigraphy, comparative anatomy, and paleontology. At that time, he wrote, every part of the Earth, every hemisphere, every continent exhibits the same phenomenon. There has therefore been a succession of variations in the economy of organic nature. The various catastrophes which have disturbed the strata have given rise to numerous shiftings of this continental basin. It is of much importance to mark that these repeated eruptions and retreats of the sea have neither been slow nor gradual. On the contrary, most of the catastrophes which occasioned them have been sudden, and this is especially easy to be proved with regard to the last of these catastrophes. So he agrees, he says, with de Luc and Dolomieu in thinking that if anything in geology be established, it is that the surface of our globe has undergone a great and sudden revolution, the date of which cannot be much earlier than 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Also, one preceding revolution at least had put the continents underwater, perhaps 2 or 3 eruptions of the sea. These alternations now appear to me to form the problem in geology that it is of most importance to solve. In order to solve it satisfactorily, it would be necessary to discover the cause of these events. These ideas have haunted, I may almost say have tormented me during my researches among fossil bones, researches which embrace but a very small part of these phenomena of the age preceding the last general revolution of the globe, and which are yet intimately connected with all the others. Many attempts have been made to answer the charge made to the geological profession by Cuvier to explain these sudden revolutions. Among others, Velikovsky tried it through his study of myths and legends. Hapgood tried it, Brown attempted, and in the process amassed a tremendous library of geological data. Well, this is, of course, the important thing. Every time the cataclysmic concept has come to life, the beast has been stoned, burned at the stake, beaten to a pulp and buried with a vengeance. But the corpse simply won't stay dead. Each time it raises the lid of its coffin and says in sepulchral tones, "You will die before I." The latest of the challengers is Professor Frank C. Hibben, who in his book The Lost Americans said, "This was no ordinary extinction of a vague geological period which fizzled to an uncertain end. This death was catastrophic and all-inclusive, what caused the death of 40 million animals. The corpus delicti in this mystery may be found almost anywhere. Their bones lie bleaching in the sands of Florida and in the gravels of New Jersey. They weather out the dry terraces of Texas and protrude from the sticky ooze of the tar pits off Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. The bodies of the victims are everywhere. We found literally thousands together, young and old, foal with dam, calf with cow. The muck pits of Alaska are filled with evidence of universal death. A picture of quick extinction. Any argument as to the cause must apply to North America, Siberia and Europe as well. Mammoth and bison were torn and twisted as though by a cosmic hand in a godly rage. In many places, the Alaskan muck blanket is packed with animal bones and debris in trainload lots. Mammoth, mastodon, bison, horses, wolves, bears and lions, a faunal population, in the middle of some cataclysmic catastrophe, was suddenly frozen in a grim charade. Now, of course, this is exactly what happened in Britain, and Comins Beaumont does go into this in quite some detail, and I think we brought that up on a previous show, one that was in the last several weeks actually. It carries on: fantastic winds, volcanic burning, inundation and burial in muck, preservation by deep freeze. Any good solution to a consuming mystery must answer all of the facts, challenges Hibben. Well, the challenge wouldn't leave me alone, says the author. The first step was to gather all of the knowledge, accepted data, everything I could find from as many earth sciences as possible. Stratigraphy, archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, radiology, oceanography, seismology, glaciology and many other fields. Correlation of the data between the sciences gave the answer. Although there is enough data in each science to indicate that these cataclysms happen, there was not enough to prove the concept. But between science, correlation showed indeed that the concept was true. Not only did it verify that the events have happened, but disclosed when the last 5 cataclysms were and what positions the shell of the Earth has been in for the last 35,000 years. So after years of research, beginning in 1949, Cuvier's challenge had an answer. Yes, indeed, the cataclysms do happen, and the last one, 6,500 years ago, was Noah's flood. All right, so they happen. What is it that happens each time? The challenge was really twofold: find the process, what happens in a cataclysm, and the trigger, what causes a cataclysm to start. And what a dramatic story of the Earth's history we uncovered. Civilizations of 20,000 years ago, more advanced than our wildest imagination. Prehistoric legends from Greece, Egypt, India and South America, which became history instead of legend. Lost continents in the Atlantic and Pacific, which became dated realities, with logical reasons for their sudden disappearance. Yes, Vishnu came alive, a man who lived through a cataclysm 70,000 years before our time, actually 10 cataclysms ago. Now he is known as the Hindu god of 10 resurrections from the waters. Osiris too was rediscovered. He was the Jesus of his time, a man of Egypt some 15,000 years ago. Noah smiled at us from the pages of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He actually was a Sumerian named Ushpaniptum, who lived 6,005 years ago. The ark he built is more than legend. Well, actually, this is tying in very nicely with the work we've done on the cataclysms and Britain's shattered isles, which is why I was quite keen to share it with you. Let's carry on. Look at the cross section of the earth inside the front. It says inside the front core. Basically, it's got the outer layer and the inner mantle and the inner core of the earth. It says you'll see two molten layers. The orange ones, the important one is the thin molten layer, about 60 miles thick. That's the Earth's surface, which is between 60 and 120 miles down below the surface of the Earth. The thick, deep molten layer, starting 1,800 miles down at the bottom of the mantle and extending 13,000 miles deeper, is the outer core. Now, both molten layers are liquid. However, the inner magnetic and electrical structure of the Earth makes these layers act as if they were near solid or plastic. As long as the magnetic and electrical structure maintains its orderliness, this old Earth keeps on rotating on its axis in a normal manner. The growing ice caps, Antarctica and Greenland, are not centred on the Earth's axis, and because they rotate around the poles, are trying to swing down to the equator. The only way they could do it would be to pull the whole 60-mile thick shell around with them. As long as the shallow molten layer stays plastic, the shell won't shift, but every few thousand years, the magnetic and electrical orderliness inside the Earth is disrupted, and the molten layer is allowed to act like a free liquid, which it was all the time anyway. It then serves as a lubricant for the ice caps to pull the shell of the Earth around inside. In a quarter to half a day, the poles move almost to the equator and all hell lets loose. The atmosphere and the oceans don't shift with the shell, they just keep on rotating west to east. And at the equator, that speed is 1,000 miles per hour. It has to be, normally, to make one rotation per day. So while the shell shifts with the poles going towards the equator, the winds and oceans go eastward, blowing across the face of the Earth with supersonic speeds, inundating continents with water miles deep. Now, what about the trigger? This turned out to be the most elusive piece of the whole puzzle. We couldn't rely on some supernatural explanation, like sometime happenings in the heavens of a vague character which actually violated the laws of nature. Well, of course, those are what go into legend, aren't they? They go into the old legends that it was the sky gods that did it. This is the very ancient part which has stayed there. And what's interesting is he's relating these to the Nagas, the Indian tales. He says it had to be something natural, a part of nature's ordinary structure which disrupts the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure whenever it happens. We once thought that sunspots could be the cause because they do disrupt the Earth's inner electrical and magnetic structure, but we were wrong. We found out that nature's power plant is a motor generator system existing in many different magnitudes. It's a basic structure of the universe. The energy structure of an atom is identical to a rotating planet, to a blue-white star, to a galaxy, to a supergalaxy, to all levels of supergalaxies, including a universe, and even more. As a neutron, which has escaped from its parent atom's neutral zone, will separate into particles, a star through a sunspot gives off neutral matter, which explodes as it becomes energized. So a galaxy gives birth to an exploding star when a dead star escapes from its neutral zone in the center. And as a dead galaxy explodes when it escapes from the central neutral zone of its parent supergalaxy. A planet, therefore, must act the same at its energy level. Wow, this is quite dense, isn't it? I've been going for 19 minutes now, so I'm going to take a short break. I'm finding this very interesting. This book is quite unique, I think, because I'd never heard of it, and that's what I like to do, to bring the listeners things that they probably wouldn't be able to find, because I do get sent this stuff, and I also do a lot of research which brings up books, and I just store them, and this is coming fresh today from 1961, The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. Let's carry straight on. So apparently, every few thousand years, neutral matter escapes from the 860-mile radius inner core into the 1,300-mile thick molten outer core, and there is a literal atomic explosion inside the Earth. The explosion in the high-energy layer of the outer core disrupts completely the electrical and magnetic structure in both the molten outer core and the outer 60-mile thick molten layer. Finally, the ice caps are allowed to pull the shell of the Earth around the interior, with the shallow molten layer lubricating the shift all the way. You can see then that ice ages are not a matter of advancing and retreating ice. It's simply that different areas of the Earth are in polar regions at different times for different durations of time, with the changes between positions taking place in a fraction of a day. The story around the world gives a silent testimony. The Berezovska mammoth frozen in mud with buttercups in his mouth, the age of the gorges below Niagara Falls and St. Anthony's Falls, both about 6,500 years, the southern end of the Laurentian Basin ice cap in Canada, about 11,500 years ago, the uninterrupted years of evolution on the Galapagos over 11,000 years ago, the geological datings in the Murrumbidgee River Basin system in Australia, showing the end of an ice cap there about 11,500 years ago, the age of fossil bones taken from the Wilshire Boulevard tar pits over 11,000 years, the sudden end of all work in the prehistoric city of Tiwanaku, Peru in 9,550 BC, or 11,500 years ago. So it carries on with many more of these examples. And he even goes into the Egyptian water clock, showing agreement with the Piri-Reis map, the Piri-Reis map was discovered in, I think, 1600s by a sailor, and it shows, the sailor's called Piri-Reis, no one knows who did the map, but the map showed the North Pole in the Sudan Basin, and it also showed Antarctica, what it would look like without the ice, which was pretty fascinating, because how would they know that? It's a bit of a mystery, this map. Look it up, the Piri-Reis map. Charles Hapgood did a book on all this, Maps of the World. Charles Hapgood, look him up. So it says the overwhelming evidence, when put in order, gives a dramatic picture of which areas have been at the North Pole when they moved to the pole and how long they were there. So he goes into these different time scales now. North Polar areas, the Arctic Ocean, 6,005 years ago it started, they say, then basically, but there is no end or duration still with that one. But the Sudan Basin, 11,500 years ago, and it ended 6,500 years ago. That's a duration of 5,000 years. Hudson Bay, 18,500 years ago. This was the beginning of where that was formed, and then 11,500 years ago was the end of it. The Caspian Sea, 29,000 years ago, ended 18,500 years ago. Wisconsin, 35,000 years ago, ended 29,000 years ago. That's a duration of 6,000 years. So, yeah, what's interesting about this is he backs up the story with these dates. And again, we're talking about cataclysms 11,500 years ago and 6,500 years ago. So he's dealing specifically with these two time periods. So he says Noah, Adam and Eve, Osiris, Taora, Zeus and Vishnu have much deeper meanings now. And as they join hands and walk with us, we hear Adam and Eve saying, listen, for now we can truly share our words with you. So then it goes on to the story, which is taking us into basically the record of legend. Years of data correlation in studying the Earth and its cataclysms and the concepts of this has shown the last one to have occurred about 6,500 years ago, that Noah or Napishtim, or whatever his name was, did exist and did survive that particular cataclysm. A friend of mine suggested that Genesis 1 is almost a perfect description of conditions on our planet immediately following a tumble. He doesn't call it cataclysm, calls it a tumble. On rereading it, I had to agree. Genesis 2 even mentions that a mist or flood went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Well now, this was worth thinking about. If it were so, then it would be the tumble preceding Noah's, about 11,500 years ago. This then could be approximately the time of the Adam and Eve story. The pursuit started If the story did originate with that tumble, in what language was it first written? Certainly not Hebrew or Greek, for as far as I know, they didn't exist at that time. If we look at men such as Don Antonio Batres Jurquai and James Churchward, we may have our answer. Certainly their knowledge of prehistoric languages could be a key, and later we'll discuss the role of Naga and ancient Mayan in the story of Adam and Eve. First, however, let's examine the history of Genesis 1, 2 and 3. There are many schools of thought on this subject, but the most predominant one is that Moses was the originator. This seems not too far-fetched, since Moses was reared in the Egyptian tradition in a royal household and probably had access to many religious writings and teachings now lost with the passing of the archives of Egypt. Of course, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, and Heliopolis and Sais. All these libraries were burned. All this stuff was lost. Certainly the Ten Commandments were a condensation of the 42 questions of Osiris for entering heaven. Now, I don't know whether this is accurate or not. I'm not really too interested in a lot of ancient Egyptian mythology. I know the story of Isis, Osiris and Horus, and there are many different versions of that. And they all seem to be wildly allegorical and pretty far-fetched. If they are based on any form of reality, it's up for question. I don't know. But it says if Moses did write part of the Old Testament, he then must have had Naga tablet writings or Egyptian interpretations of them. That's a fair point, handed down to the Egyptians for thousands of years, and the Egyptian priesthood had knowledge of a cataclysm 11,500 years ago. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note the 9,000 plus 600 BC, 1950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. So it goes on then about Moses, his brother Aaron, and the priesthood, which we don't really need to get into. And then it goes, now, through Ezra's reconstruction of Genesis, we are told many things. One, because of the usage of tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, and other words which were glyphs in the picture language of prehistory. It is evident that the creation and Adam and Eve stories were probably originally written in the glyphs of Naga, the predominant Eastern Hemisphere language of 11,500 years ago. This language is nearly identical to ancient Mayan and the progenitor of many languages, including Oriental and Polynesian tongues, Egyptian, Greek and Yakut. Moses and possibly Aaron may have had access to these tablets or Egyptian versions of them. Neither Moses nor Aaron knew how to read the ancient language, therefore read the glyphs quite literally. Not being able to read the symbolism of Naga glyphs, in addition to reading them literally, Moses and Aaron and possibly Ezra read into the Adam and Eve story the social and religious attitudes of their day. In that time, woman was regarded as the root of all sin, a lowly creature, her birth recorded only as an exception and basically being the cause of man's downfall, a daily potential. This attitude persists in some religions even to our time. Is it any wonder that Eve was shouldered with the responsibility for the downfall of all mankind, a result of interpretations read into the Naga by Moses and into Moses reading by Ezra? Perhaps also it was read into the story of Egyptian priests long before Moses' time and passed on to him as history. The fusing of two stories into one to make the story of Genesis 1, 2 and 3 may confuse the man with Adam. It is possible that Adam, being only 9 generations ahead of Noah, with the time span of the Sudan Basin polar era covering 5,000 years, was not the man referred to in the creation, but his name and later experience were merged with the man's story. Remember, however, we are informed that Ezra dictated the entire history to 5 scribes from memory, and this work contains Genesis as we know it today. For him to recall from the archives of his mind what he did, as well as he did, certainly bespeaks of inspiration of a high order, but it also appears evident that he had no knowledge of the fact that 5,000 years transpired between Genesis 1 and Noah's flood. It is clear from 2 Esdras 3:9 that Genesis 1 and Noah's flood represented 2 inundations. However, for while speaking of the 2 occasions, he says of Noah's flood, and again in process of time thou broughtest the flood upon those that dwelt in the world and destroyest them. So, we'll move on a bit. And it says, in the light of the fact that in addition to overwhelming scientific evidence, there are countless legends in the Asia-Pacific area, handed down from the inundation of 11,500 years ago, of a creation much like that of Genesis 1 and 2. Is it not possible that the man of the Genesis story becomes confused with Adam throughout the thousands of years and through a succeeding tumble and inundation in Noah's time 6,500 years ago? The miracle actually is that the whole story of creation and of Adam and Eve is as undistorted as it is. Being 11,500 years old, it has suffered through many debacles visited upon its guardians in the intervening years. Because of the lack of resolving information, the man and Adam are kept as one in this translation interpretation. So then it goes into the significant Naga glyphs, which were given to us by Ezra through Moses' direct reading. And these words that are used, and the symbolism is cherubims, rib, Adam's sleep, man, woman, tree, fruit, serpent, flaming sword. Our knowledge of Naga glyphs tells us that the tree of life symbolized a mother continent, a parent civilization lasting thousands of years longer than ours of today. An unadorned serpent represented water or the ocean. A serpent entwined about the tree signified that the mother continent was surrounded by water. Genesis 3:15 actually describes Eve's heel on the serpent's head, showing her victory over the oceans. Cherubims were not pretty plump babies, but hybrid man and beast, with the glyphs for legs or foundations or underpinnings. Instead of being placed in the Garden of Eden, one was taken away, and a Naga or Maya reading of the Egyptian Book of the Dead shows that cherubims of the north, east, south and west were taken away, meaning that the foundations of the mother continent in all directions were removed or destroyed. The flaming sword was the symbol of fire and earthquake. The fire signified what all legends of these cataclysms call earth fire, which is the molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell breaking through to the surface during a tumble, a literal hell. It is most probably the origin of man's concept of hell, as a matter of fact. So then he goes back to the tree of life and the eating of the fruit and the symbolism there. And he says they realised that in order to survive, they had to leave and never try to return, for the motherland was to be destroyed by a cataclysmic inundation. They left. This is Adam and Eve, of course. And afterwards, the continent, the tree, was subjected to a fiery earthquake, the flaming sword, during which it lost its foundations, cherubims, and sank beneath the ocean, the serpent, which forever afterwards walked over the sunken continent on its belly. Well, I think this could be stretching it a little bit, but I'm finding that the correlation here of the 6,500 years ago and the 11,500 years ago is very interesting and very, very credible. So let's review the event. 2 cataclysms ago, and then apply our knowledge toward a representative translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2 and 3. It may be the most accurate reading of a story written 11,500 years ago. So then he goes into the event. So look at a globe of the world. Pick out longitude 90 degrees west, latitude 60 degrees north. This point is in the western part of the Hudson Bay. Now hold the globe so that 90 degrees west to 60 degrees north is at the North Pole on the axis of rotation. This was the configuration of the world between 18,500 years ago and 11,500 years ago. The North Polar ice cap formed the Laurentian Basin in Canada. The continents, however, were not quite the same. There was a huge continent in the Atlantic Ocean area, which stretched from Iceland and England across the Atlantic to the Bahamas. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea did not exist. They were land at the time. There was another continent in the Pacific, covering an area now ringed by the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos, Easter Island, Tahiti, the Solomons, and Caroline Islands. The province of Ceylon held the major civilization of India, Egypt, and the Holy Land. On the Holy Land, it says, were thriving mixtures of vegetation and civilization. Greece, land of the Hellenes, was the home of a tall, blue-eyed blonde race with standards of science and law unmatched to this day. The Amazon basin was an inland sea. Legends call it the Sea of Zaraxes and the mouth of the Amazon River. And then a wide seagoing connection between the Atlantic and the Zaraxes. The western coast of South America was not mountainous. The prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Peru, now at 12,000 feet above the Pacific, was then at sea level. It was a metropolis seaport with a canal system for seagoing ships as large as any we have today, traversing from the Pacific to the inland sea. About 11,500 years ago, in 9,500 BC, as dated by astronomers from the Potsdam Observatory from writings in the ruins of Tiahuanaco, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth shifted its position once more in a quarter to half a day, 7,000 years after the previous shift. The North Pole moved southward and the Sudan Basin in Africa shifted to the North Pole. This was the time which the Talmud states was the setting of the Pleiades below the horizon, when the Holy Land was moved into a region of terrible cold for many generations, actually for 5,000 years until Noah's flood 6,005 years ago. Now, interestingly here, it makes the point that this stretched as far as England. And of course, with the Cummins-Beaumont theories, we have the idea that, of course, the Shetlands going up as far as the Hebrides, these were all part of the landmass, along with Scandinavia, of the continent, which was previously there before Cummins-Beaumont's estimated cataclysm time of 1322 BC. So this, I think, is really fascinating and such a short book. And let's carry on with just summing up now. Of the great continent in the Atlantic, only a large island was left in the west, while the ocean between there and Gibraltar to the east was left shallow, muddy and impassable to ships. A thread of a clue concerning the great knowledge of that time came out when Captain Cook discovered the Polynesian Maori tribe in New Zealand in the 1700s. They told him of ancient legends of Saturn's rings, and they hadn't even heard of telescopes. Now you try to see those rings with your naked eyes and you'll find out that it's impossible. Now, this ties really nicely in to the Saturn theory. In other words, that Saturn was in a very different position in the sky. Now, of course, scientists will not accept this, that the planets have actually shifted. But when you look at the mythology, and we've done shows on the Saturn cult, and Troy McLaughlin did a great book on it all, the Saturn death cult, and he puts across very good arguments for Saturn being the sun at the time. It was in a central place in the sky, and it was much more visible to the naked eye, and these legends rose up around it because people could see it. So that explains what he's saying here about the Maoris being able to see Saturn's rings. So the evidence in Tiahuanaco shows that their great civilization was wiped out so suddenly that people were caught in the middle of their normal daytime activities by catastrophic inundation. Further evidence shows that this fabulous city suffered the same fate as Easter Island. Although the Rockies and the Andes were started in this cataclysm, Tiahuanaco was buried under the Pacific to remain there for 5,000 years, then to be heaved up to its present altitude of 12,500 feet in the last cataclysm 6,500 years ago. So the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago saw the Hudson Bay and the opposite polar area just southwest of Australia both roll down to the equator on opposite sides of the Earth, and the Sudan Basin region would roll to the North Pole to remain there for the next 5,000 years. While this shift was occurring, taking only a quarter to half a day to complete itself, the Earth's oceans and atmosphere through angular momentum kept rotating in their normal direction during most of the shift, with the oceans violently inundating most of the lands of the Earth and the atmospheric bringing unimaginable hurricanes of supersonic wind velocities. Whole continents were subjected to tremendous upheavals and earthquakes. The molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell broke through the shell in places all over the world and was thereafter called Earth Fire by the pitiful few who survived. The oceans and winds took 6 days after the start of the cataclysm to resolve their holocaustic wars on the surface of the earth, and on the 7th day began to settle down to 5,000 years of normal complacency. So he goes then into Genesis, and he talks about the genesis of the earth, the accepted 4.5 billion year old earth, and this regenesis 11,500 years ago, stating that both of these are what is talked about in the Bible. And he says a translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2 and 3 from a reconstruction of what the Naga must have been to give us the chapters as we have had them in English, then retranslating directly from Naga to English, bypassing Greek and Hebrew. And he goes into the book of Genesis, which finishes it off. In the beginning, 4.5 billion years ago, he says, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun and our planet Earth. Now, this is if you go for the 4.5 billion years. I'm starting to believe that the Earth is not as old as we're being told. And there is a theory that it's only 10,000 years old, which would have... I mean, we don't know. This is the whole point. We don't know. And with history being erased by the day on the planet, it's a good time to be looking into this sort of information, I think. He says that during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, this one being 11,005 years ago, the Earth's lands were all inundated with raging waters and ravaged by horrendous winds, and the oceans were all dark with muddiness, and the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth as God intended. And while the Holocaust was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were re-established and distinguishable, and it was good. And the sunlight was daytime again, and darkness again it was at night time in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. Again, God's original design was that there be a sky between the clouds and the oceans. And in accordance with God's design, the heavens were re-established, and that sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans as the onslaught of the great storms abated. And God's heavens were indeed re-established, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans, as they were immediately following a cataclysm, so the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. And in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth and the waters ocean. And once again, it was re-established and good as God intended. And he goes on with the rest of the Genesis story, which is quite long, and I'm sure most people are familiar with it. But I think that these documents are really fascinating. I've come to the conclusion that the earth has had many cataclysms, and I think the timescale of these is very, very strongly supported by the evidence. So 11,500 years ago to 6,500 years ago, and we have Comins-Beaumont's more recent theory, which started 1322 BC at Fingal's Cave in Scotland and smashed apart the continent, which was Scandinavia, Scotland, the British Isles, were what was left after the cataclysm, which is why Britain's an island, of course. But this story that we're told here and the evidence it gives is quite compelling, and obviously been looking at a lot of research just to come up with this very short volume. So the book is called The Adam and Eve Story by Chan Thomas. It was published in 1961, and it came in a bundle from Sarah this morning, who sent it to me, and it says declassified in part, sanitized copy approved for release 2013. What's that? 24th of the 6th, 2013. So I don't know what any of that's about, and the book is actually in with a load of other documents which are, as we said, really about global concerns, the concerns of the globalists. So quite interesting, and I hope you found that useful and a basis for further research. So until the next show, and there will be many coming up, that's it for this show. But watch out for a new interview with Stephen Strong and some other interviews which are a little bit different from our recent shows.